My name is Hartwell McKinnon, and at 82 years old, I thought I knew everything about life, death, and what comes after. I was wrong. 3 months ago, I sat beside my wife Eva's hospital bed, watching the woman I'd loved for 60 years slip away from me. The machines beeped steadily, marking time like a metronome counting down to silence. Her breath came in shallow whispers, and I held her frail hand, feeling the wedding ring that had circled her finger since 1963. "Heart," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of medical equipment. I leaned closer, desperate to catch every precious word. "Promise me something." "Anything, sweetheart. Anything at all." Her eyes, still sharp despite everything, locked onto mine with an intensity that made my chest tighten. "When I'm gone, you're going to find him. Jesus is waiting for you, Heart. He's been waiting your whole stubborn life." I felt my jaw clench involuntarily. Even now, even here, she was trying to convert me. 60 years of marriage, and she'd never given up on saving my soul. I wanted to argue, to tell her this wasn't the time, but her grip on my hand suddenly strengthened with impossible force. "Listen to me carefully," she continued, her voice gaining an otherworldly clarity that made my skin prickle. "Next Sunday, exactly 1 week after my funeral, you're going to walk into Cornerstone Baptist. Pastor Thornfield will be preaching about the prodigal son, and when he gets to the part about coming home, you're going to feel something break open inside your chest. That's when you'll know." My throat felt tight. "Eva, please don't..." And Heart, her voice dropped to the faintest whisper. "The third pew from the back, right side. That's where you'll sit. That's where everything changes." Those were the last words my wife ever spoke to me. She closed her eyes, smiled peacefully, and slipped into eternity, leaving me alone with a prophecy that made absolutely no sense. I buried Eva on a Tuesday. By Saturday night, I was standing in my empty kitchen, staring at the church bulletin she'd left on the counter, wondering if grief had finally driven me completely insane. The morning after Eva's funeral, I found myself doing something I hadn't done in decades. I prayed. Well, if you could call angry muttering at the ceiling prayer. "If you're really up there," I said to the empty bedroom we'd shared for 43 years, "you took the wrong person. She believed in you. I never did." But as I sat there in the silence, memories flooded back like a dam had burst. Eva Marie Patterson, aged 22, standing in the doorway of Murphy's Diner in downtown Birmingham, Alabama, 1963. I was 23, fresh out of the army, cocky as they come, and absolutely certain that God was nothing more than a fairy tale for weak minds. She was the Sunday school teacher at Cornerstone Baptist, the preacher's daughter who could quote scripture like poetry and bake communion bread every first Sunday of the month. I was the mechanic who worked Sundays, drank beer on church steps, and made jokes about walking on water. "Hart McKinnon," she'd said that first day, setting down my coffee with a smile that could have powered the whole diner. "I've been praying for you." "Lady, you don't even know me," I'd laughed, stirring sugar into my cup. "I know you're lost," she'd replied simply. "And I know God's got plans for you, whether you believe it or not." I should have run right then. Instead, I found myself coming back to Murphy's every day for 2 weeks straight just to argue theology with the prettiest girl in Jefferson County. She'd quote Jesus, I'd quote Darwin. She'd talk about faith, I'd talk about science. She'd speak of eternal love, I'd speak of biological imperatives. But somewhere between the debates and the sweet tea, something happened that neither of us expected. We fell hopelessly, completely in love. Not the kind that burns bright and fast, but the kind that settles into your bones and changes your DNA. When I proposed in 1964, I made my position crystal clear. "Eva, I love you more than life itself, but I'm never going to be a church-going man. I won't pretend to believe something I don't. Can you live with that?" She'd looked at me for a long moment, those green eyes seeing straight through to my soul. "Hart McKinnon, I can live with anything except living without you. But I'm never going to stop praying for your salvation. Can you live with that?" And so began our beautiful, stubborn, 60-year dance. She'd wake up early every Sunday morning, put on her best dress, and kiss my forehead. "Church is at 11 if you change your mind," she'd say, same as always. "Save me a seat," I'd reply, same as always, knowing full well I'd be in the garage, elbow deep in some engine, avoiding the judgment of congregation members who thought she'd married beneath herself. But here's the thing, people never understood about Eva and me. Our love wasn't despite our differences, it was because of them. She kept me grounded when my cynicism threatened to consume everything beautiful. I kept her human when her faith threatened to make her forget that doubt and struggle were part of the journey too. 60 years. 60 years of her leaving little Bible verses in my lunchbox. 60 years of me leaving love notes in her hymnal. 60 years of her saying grace over every meal while I sat respectfully silent. 60 years of me holding her when she cried over friends who'd lost their faith, and her holding me when I raged against a universe that seemed fundamentally unfair. We buried both our children, little James at 3 from leukemia, and our daughter Sarah at 47 from cancer. Eva never questioned God's plan. I cursed him loudly and often, but we grieved together, holding each other through nights when faith and doubt seemed equally cruel companions. Now, sitting in our bedroom staring at her empty pillow, I realized something that made my chest ache. She'd never stopped believing I'd come around. Even in those final moments, even with death stealing her breath, she was still trying to save my stubborn soul. The church bulletin lay on her nightstand where she'd left it, folded to next Sunday's service. "The prodigal son returns home." Reverend Silas Thornfield preaching. Third pew from the back, right side. My hands were shaking as I picked up that bulletin, and for the first time in 82 years, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, my Eva knew something I didn't. Sunday morning arrived like a sentencing. I'd spent the entire week telling myself that Eva's final words were nothing more than the confused ramblings of a dying mind. Morphine-induced hallucinations mixed with 60 years of wishful thinking. But as I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, fumbling with a tie I hadn't worn since her funeral, something cold settled in my stomach. I wasn't going to church because I believed. I was going because I needed to prove to myself that my wife's final prophecy was just the desperate hope of a faithful woman who'd loved a faithless man. The drive to Cornerstone Baptist took exactly 12 minutes. The same route Eva had taken every Sunday for 6 decades, while I stayed home reading the newspaper and pretending I didn't feel guilty. The parking lot was fuller than I remembered, filled with families in their Sunday best, children clutching coloring books, elderly couples moving slowly but surely towards salvation. I sat in my truck for 10 minutes, engine off, watching people I'd known for decades file into the building. Mrs. Henderson from the grocery store, the Pattersons from down the street, young families I didn't recognize, probably drawn by Pastor Thornfield's reputation for straight talk and genuine compassion. "This is ridiculous," I muttered to myself. "You're 82 years old, Hart McKinnon. Stop acting like a scared child." But my legs felt like lead as I walked toward those familiar white doors. The last time I'd been inside this building was for Eva's funeral, and before that, not since our wedding day in 1964. 59 years of Sundays spent anywhere but here. The moment I stepped inside, the smell hit me. Old wood, hymnal pages, and something indefinable that Eva used to call the presence of the Lord. To me, it just smelled like guilt and obligation. But today there was something else, something that made the hair on my arms stand up. People turned to stare as I made my way down the aisle, and I could practically hear the whispers. "That's Hart McKinnon, Eva's husband. Never seen him in here except for funerals and weddings." Some nodded respectfully. Others looked genuinely shocked. A few smiled with what looked like hope. And there it was, the third pew from the back right side, exactly as Eva had specified. I slid into that pew and immediately felt foolish. What was I expecting? Lightning bolts? Angelic choirs? Some cosmic confirmation that my wife had received divine revelation in her final moments? The service began normally enough. Hymns I half remembered from childhood, announcements about potluck dinners and youth group activities, the familiar rhythm of small-town Baptist worship that hadn't changed in decades. I found myself relaxing, almost enjoying the normalcy of it all. Then, Pastor Thornfield stepped up to the pulpit. Silas Thornfield was a man I'd known peripherally for 20 years, Eva's pastor, a kind soul who'd visited her in the hospital, who'd spoken beautiful words at her funeral. He was 75, tall and lean, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to see straight through pretense. "Friends," he began, his voice carrying easily through the sanctuary, "today we're talking about coming home, about the long journey back to the Father's house, about the son who wandered far from everything he'd been taught, everything he'd known, convinced he could make his own way in the world." My blood went cold, the prodigal son. Exactly as Ava had predicted, Pastor Thornfield opened his Bible and I found myself leaning forward, despite every instinct telling me to run. "Luke chapter 15, verse 11, he read. "And he said, a certain man had 2 sons. Oh," as he began to tell the familiar parable, something strange started happening in my chest, a tightness, like someone was slowly turning a key in a lock I'd kept sealed for 8 decades. I tried to dismiss it as heartburn, stress, grief playing tricks on an old man's body. But when Pastor Thornfield reached the part about the son coming to himself in the far country, realizing what he'd lost, something cracked open inside me. Not broke, cracked, like an egg about to hatch, like a seed splitting to let in light. "The father saw him coming from a long way off," Pastor Thornfield continued, his voice growing stronger, "and he ran to meet him. Ran. Can you picture it? This dignified patriarch, lifting his robes and running down that dusty road to embrace the child who'd broken his heart." The crack in my chest widened, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in my entire adult life, the unmistakable sensation that I was not alone in that pew. Someone was sitting beside me, invisible but undeniably present, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with possibility. That's when Pastor Thornfield looked directly at me and said, "Sometimes it takes a lifetime of wandering to realize you've been running toward home all along." The world tilted. Everything Eva had predicted was happening exactly as she'd said it would. Third pew from the back, the prodigal son sermon. The moment when something would break open in my chest. I gripped the pew in front of me, my knuckles white, my heart pounding like I was 23 again, and seeing Eva for the first time. Maybe, just maybe, my wife had known something I didn't. The service ended, but I couldn't move. People filed past me, some nodding politely, others stopping to shake my hand and murmur condolences about Eva. I smiled and thanked them, but inside I was reeling. Every word Pastor Thornfield had spoken seemed to have been aimed directly at me, like Eva herself had written the sermon from beyond the grave. "Hart McKinnon." Pastor Thornfield's voice cut through my thoughts. I looked up to find him standing at the end of my pew, his weathered face kind but searching. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "Neither was I admitted, struggling to stand on legs that felt suddenly ancient. "Pastor, can I ask you something? Did she ever talk to you about me?" "About today, specifically." Something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, maybe even surprise. "Why don't you come to my office? We should talk." 10 minutes later, I sat across from Pastor Thornfield in a small book-lined room behind the sanctuary. Photos of church members covered one wall, baptisms, weddings, confirmations. I spotted Eva in several of them, always smiling, always radiant with the faith that had sustained her through our entire marriage. "Eva visited me 3 weeks before she died," Pastor Thornfield said, settling into his chair. "She was weak, but determined. Said she had something important to discuss." My mouth went dry. "What did she say?" "She asked me to pray for you, specifically. Said that after her passing you'd be coming to church and that I needed to be ready for you." I thought it was wishful thinking, Hart. A dying woman's desperate hope. "Did she say anything else?" Pastor Thornfield leaned forward, his expression grave. She said you'd been running from God your whole life, but that he'd been chasing you just as long. She said your heart was harder than most because you'd been hurt by religion when you were young, and that it would take something miraculous to crack it open. I felt my chest tighten again, that same sensation from the service. How could she know that? I never told her about. The words died in my throat. I'd never told Eva about Father Mackenzie at the Catholic orphanage where I'd spent 3 years as a boy. Never told her about the things that twisted old man had done to me and the other children in the name of God. Never told her why the very word faith tasted like ashes in my mouth. She didn't know the details, Pastor Thornfield said gently, but she knew the wound was there. She said you'd built walls so high that only God himself could scale them. I stood up abruptly, panic flooding my system. This was too much, too fast. Pastor, I appreciate you talking with me, but I think I made a mistake coming here. Eva was. She was a wonderful woman, but she was wrong about me. I'm not the kind of man who finds religion at 82. Hart, wait. Pastor Thornfield's voice stopped me at the door. She left something for you. Said to give it to you when you were ready to receive it. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a small, cream-colored envelope. My name was written on the front in Ava's careful script, the same handwriting that had packed my lunch for 40 years, that had signed birthday cards and anniversary notes, that had left little love messages on my bathroom mirror. My hands shook as I took it. When did she give you this? The day she died, her last visit to this office. She said you'd know when the time was right to read it. I stared at that envelope like it might explode in my hands. Part of me wanted to tear it open immediately. Part of me wanted to burn it and pretend this whole morning had been a fever dream. I need to think about this, I said finally. Of course, but Hart. Pastor Thornfield stood and placed a hand on my shoulder. Eva loved you exactly as you were, but she also saw who you could become. Maybe it's time you saw it too. I drove home in silence, Ava's letter burning like a coal in my jacket pocket. The house felt emptier than usual, if that was even possible. I set the envelope on the kitchen table and stared at it while I made coffee with trembling hands. For 60 years, Eva had respected my boundaries about faith. She'd never pushed, never demanded, never made ultimatums. She'd simply loved me and prayed for me and waited with the patience of someone who believed in miracles. But now she was gone, and I was alone with a promise I'd never made and a letter I was terrified to read. Outside, the afternoon stretched long and quiet, giving me too much time to think about what Pastor Thornfield had said. God had been chasing me my whole life. If that were true, I thought grimly, then he was about to catch a very tired, very stubborn old man who didn't know the first thing about surrender. The envelope seemed to pulse on that table, waiting for a decision I wasn't ready to make. I circled that letter for 3 days, like a dog afraid of his own shadow. Monday morning, I'd pick it up, then set it down again. Tuesday afternoon, I carried it to my recliner, then took it back to the kitchen table without breaking the seal. Wednesday evening, I held it up to the light, trying to see through the envelope, but Eva's careful script revealed nothing. Thursday morning, I couldn't take it anymore. My hands were steadier after my second cup of coffee, so I sat at the kitchen table where Eva and I had shared 22,000 breakfasts and carefully opened the envelope. The letter was written on her favorite stationery, pale blue with tiny flowers in the corners. I could picture her at this same table, choosing her words carefully, knowing these might be the most important she'd ever write to me. My dearest Hart, if you're reading this, then everything happened exactly as I saw it would. Don't ask me how I knew. Some things are mysteries even to those who believe. But I saw you in that third pew, heard you listening to Silas preach about coming home, felt the moment when your heart finally cracked open to let the light in. You're probably scared right now. You've been scared of God since you were 7 years old, and that awful man at St. Mary's taught you that religion meant pain. I know about Father Mackenzie, Hart. I've always known. The letter slipped from my fingers. She knew. How was that possible? I'd never told a soul about those 3 years at the orphanage, about the night terrors that had haunted me until I was 30, about why I flinched whenever anyone talked about God's love. With shaking hands, I picked up the letter and continued reading. I know because I saw you wake up screaming his name 2 weeks after our wedding. You were so ashamed, so certain I'd leave you if I knew the truth. But sweetheart, love doesn't work that way. Real love sees the broken places and loves harder, not less. I never pushed you toward faith because I knew you had to come to it on your own terms, in your own time. Forced belief isn't belief at all. It's just performance. But I also knew that the God I served wasn't the monster that man showed you. The real God, the one I've been praying to for you every single day for 60 years, he's been waiting for you to stop running long enough to see his true face. Heart, you are not damaged goods. You are not unworthy. You are not too old, too stubborn, or too broken for grace. You are exactly who God has been preparing for this moment your entire life. I need you to do something for me, something I never asked while I was alive because I knew you weren't ready. I need you to forgive Father Mackenzie, not for his sake. He'll answer to God for what he did, but for yours. That poison has been eating at you for 75 years, and it's time to spit it out. I stood up so fast the chair fell backward. Forgive him. Forgive the man who had stolen my childhood, my ability to trust, my faith in anything good or holy. Eva was asking the impossible, but her words continued, as if she could see my reaction from wherever she was now. I know it seems impossible. When I was diagnosed, I had to forgive God for taking me away from you too soon. That felt impossible too. But here's what I learned about forgiveness, my love. It's not about feelings. It's about choosing freedom over prison. You've been locked in that cell with Father Mackenzie for 75 years. Isn't it time to walk out? There's more I need to tell you, but not in this letter. Pastor Thornfield has a key to our safety deposit box. Box 247 at First National. Inside, you'll find letters I've been writing to God about you since 1963. Read them when you're ready to see how loved you've always been. One last thing, heart. When you finally say yes to Jesus, and you will, stubborn man, don't do it for me. Don't do it because you think you owe it to my memory. Do it because you're finally ready to come home to yourself. Do it because you're tired of running from the love that's been chasing you your whole life. I'll be waiting for you on the other side, my darling. But until then, live. Really live. Let yourself be loved the way God intended. Forever yours. Eva P.S. Check the attic. There's a box marked for heart behind the Christmas decorations. You'll know when you're ready for what's inside. I sat on my kitchen floor and cried like I hadn't cried since I was 7 years old. Not the dignified tears of an elderly widower, but the raw, ugly sobs of a child who'd been carrying a weight too heavy for his shoulders. She'd known. All along, she'd known about the nightmares, the shame, the reason I couldn't bow my head when she said grace. And she'd loved me anyway. More than that, she'd seen through the damage to something worth saving. Outside, the afternoon sun was setting, casting long shadows across the empty house. Somewhere in the attic, another revelation waited. In a safety deposit box across town, 60 years of secret prayers sat in the darkness. But for now, I just sat on that kitchen floor, holding my wife's final letter, and for the first time in 75 years, I whispered a name I'd been afraid to say, Jesus. The word didn't strike me dead. Lightning didn't split the sky. But something inside my chest shifted, like a door that had been locked for a lifetime, finally hearing the key turn. The next morning, I called Pastor Thornfield. My voice cracked when I spoke, still raw from the night I'd spent reading Eva's letter over and over until I'd memorized every word. Pastor, it's Hart McKinnon. I need to see you. Today, if possible. Of course, Hart. Are you all right? You sound different, I finished for him. Yeah, I feel different too. Can you meet me at the bank? Eva left something in our safety deposit box. An hour later, we sat in a small, windowless room at First National Bank, surrounded by the institutional smell of carpet cleaner and old money. The safety deposit box sat open between us, and inside was a collection that took my breath away. Dozens of letters, all addressed to God, all written in Eva's careful handwriting, spanning 6 decades. Pastor Thornfield whistled low. She never mentioned these to me. I picked up the oldest letter, dated September 15th, 1963, just 2 weeks after our first date at Murphy's Diner. My hands shook as I read the opening lines. "Dear Lord, I met him today, Hart McKinnon. He doesn't believe in you yet, but I can see his heart underneath all that anger. He's been hurt by someone who claimed to serve you. Help me love him the way you love him, patiently, persistently, without condition." "She knew from the beginning," I whispered. "Look at this one from 1967. Lord, Hart had another nightmare about the priest. He thinks I'm asleep, but I hear him crying. Show me how to heal wounds I can't even see. Make me strong enough to love away 70 years of pain." Pastor Thornfield was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Hart, I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you years ago." I looked up from the letters. "What is it?" "I knew Father Mackenzie. He was transferred to our county in 1978 when you and Eva had been married about 14 years. The bishop thought a small-town parish would be better for him." My blood turned to ice. "He was here? In our town?" "For 6 months. There were incidents with children in our community. When the reports started coming in, I went to the authorities myself. He was removed and sent to a treatment facility, then defrocked. But Hart," Pastor Thornfield's voice broke, "I've carried the guilt of that for 47 years. If I had acted sooner, been more vigilant." "You stopped him," I said quietly, surprised by my own response. "You protected children, but not soon enough. And I never connected him to your situation until Eva told me about your past. She didn't give me details, just said you'd been hurt by clergy as a child. When she said the name Mackenzie," he shook his head, "I realized you'd probably crossed paths with him somewhere." A strange calm settled over me. Here was information that should have sent me into a rage. The monster from my childhood had been in my own backyard, potentially threatening other children while I lived in ignorance just miles away. But instead, I felt something else entirely. "Eva knew, didn't she? She knew he was here." Pastor Thornfield nodded slowly. "She came to see me when the reports first surfaced. Asked if there was anything she could do to help the families. She never said why, but now I understand. She was protecting you from having to relive that trauma." I picked up another letter, this one dated March 1978. "Lord, he's here. The man who hurt my heart is here in our town. Hart doesn't know, and I pray he never has to find out. But if you can use this terrible situation for good, please let those children find justice and healing. And please, Lord, help Hart forgive this man someday. Not for Father Mackenzie's sake, but for Hart's freedom. She was praying for my forgiveness 30 years before she asked me to consider it," I murmured. "She was preparing the way." Pastor Thornfield leaned forward. "Hart, what Eva did by keeping that from you. Some people might call it deception." "Some people might," I agreed, tucking the letter back into the box. "But I call it love. She knew I wasn't ready to face him. Hell, I'm barely ready now, and he's been dead for 15 years. He died in 2008, alone in a state facility. Never admitted to what he'd done, never sought forgiveness." I sat with that information, waiting for the familiar surge of anger, the satisfaction of knowing my abuser had suffered. But instead I felt something unexpected. Pity. A deep, aching sadness for a man who'd been so broken he'd broken others, and who died without ever finding the peace that comes with true repentance. "Pastor," I said slowly, "I think I'm ready to try something I never thought I'd be able to do." "What's that?" "I think I'm ready to forgive him. Not because he deserves it, but because Eva was right. I'm tired of carrying him around with me. I'm 82 years old, and I want to be free." Pastor Thornfield's eyes filled with tears. "Hart, that's what grace looks like. Real grace." We sat in silence for a moment, surrounded by 6 decades of my wife's secret prayers. Finally, I spoke again. "There's something else Eva mentioned. A box in the attic. I haven't looked yet, but I think it's time. Would you like me to come with you?" I considered the offer. For 75 years, I'd face my demons alone, but maybe it was time to accept help, to let someone else share the load. Yes, I said, I think I would. That afternoon, Pastor Thornfield and I stood in my dusty attic, flashlights cutting through the shadows between Christmas decorations and forgotten furniture. The box Eva had mentioned sat exactly where she'd said it would be, behind the artificial tree marked for heart in her unmistakable handwriting. It was heavier than I'd expected, about the size of a banker's box, sealed with aging masking tape. My hands trembled as I carried it down to the living room, Pastor Thornfield following silently behind me. "You sure you want company for this?" he asked as we settled into chairs facing each other. "I'm sure," I said, though my voice shook. "I've been alone with secrets too long." The tape peeled away easily, as if Eva had chosen it specifically to make this moment as simple as possible. Inside, I found layers of items wrapped in tissue paper, each marked with a date. The top item was labeled Christmas 1964, our first fight. I unwrapped it carefully and found a small wooden cross, roughly carved and obviously homemade. A note was attached. "You stormed out when I mentioned midnight service. I carved this while waiting for you to come home. I wanted you to know that love doesn't keep score of arguments." "Eva, I remember that night," I whispered. "We'd only been married 6 months. I was so angry that she'd assumed I'd go to church just because it was Christmas." Pastor Thornfield examined the cross. "She made this. Eva could carve anything. Her father taught her when she was little." I set the cross aside and reached for the next item. Valentine's Day 1967, Heart's Nightmare. This package contained a small prayer journal, pages filled with Eva's handwriting. I opened it randomly and read aloud. "February 14th, Heart woke screaming again. 3rd time this week. He won't tell me what the dreams are about, but I hear him whispering, 'Please don't make me,' over and over. Lord, whatever happened to him, please heal those wounds. Show me how to love him through this." My throat tightened. I had no idea she was writing these things down. The next item was larger, dated Christmas 1975, the year Heart almost came to church. Inside was a photograph of me standing in our bedroom doorway, halfway dressed in a suit and tie, looking torn and miserable. "She took this?" "I almost did it that year," I said, staring at my younger self. "Got as far as putting on the suit, but I couldn't make my feet move toward that door." Package after package revealed a secret history of our marriage, Ava's careful documentation of my spiritual struggle. There was a small Bible, clearly well used, with passages marked that related to forgiveness, healing from childhood trauma, and God's patience with stubborn hearts. Notes were written in the margins: "For Heart when he's ready, for Heart when he stops running, for Heart when he finally comes home." Halfway through the box, I found something that made my breath catch. A letter addressed to Father Mackenzie, written in Eva's hand but never sent, dated 1978. "Oh my God," I breathed. She wrote to him. Pastor Thornfield leaned forward as I read aloud with a shaking voice. "Dear Father Mackenzie, you don't know me, but I know what you did to my husband when he was 7 years old. I know about the other children too. I want you to understand something. Hart is now a man of 43, married to someone who loves him desperately, and he is good and kind and worthy despite what you tried to convince him. Your evil did not win. It wounded him, yes, but it did not destroy him. Someday, when he is strong enough, he will forgive you. Not because you deserve it, but because forgiveness will set him free. I pray for your soul. Though I struggle to mean it, I pray that you will find genuine repentance before you face your Creator. But mostly, I pray that Heart will find peace. Mrs. Eva McKinnon, she never mailed it," Pastor Thornfield observed gently. "No, but she needed to write it. She needed to confront him, even if only on paper." I folded the letter carefully. "Look what else is here." The bottom of the box contained dozens of small items. movie ticket stubs from dates when Eva had tried to cheer me up after particularly bad nightmares, receipts from the hardware store where she'd bought materials for projects designed to keep my hands and mind busy during dark periods, even prescription bottles from doctors she'd convinced me to see over the years. But the last item nearly brought me to my knees. It was a small wooden box, intricately carved with my initials. Inside was a collection of prayers written on tiny pieces of paper, folded small and obviously handled many times. I unfolded one at random, day 21, 915 of Loving Heart McKinnon. Lord, he's getting older, and I'm running out of time to see him find peace. If you take me first, please don't let him think you don't want him. He's been yours all along. He just doesn't know it yet. 21,915 days, Pastor Thornfield calculated quietly. That's exactly 60 years from your wedding day. She counted every single day, I whispered. Every day we were married, she prayed for my salvation. At the very bottom of the wooden box was one final note, this one obviously recent. Heart, if you're reading this, then you've finally stopped running. I'm so proud of you, my love. You were never broken. You were just being prepared for something beautiful. The cross I carved in 1964 is yours now. Not because you need a symbol, but because sometimes it helps to hold something real when faith feels impossible. I love you. I've always loved you. Now go love others the way Christ loves you, completely, fearlessly, without condition. Your time is just beginning. I sat in my living room, surrounded by 60 years of secret love, and felt something inside me shift permanently. This wasn't just about forgiveness anymore, or even about faith. This was about love so profound, it had spent 6 decades preparing a path for my wounded heart to walk toward healing. Pastor, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper, I think I'm ready to stop running. What does that mean, heart? I picked up the wooden cross Eva had carved during our first fight, feeling the rough edges where her young hands had worked to create something beautiful from raw wood. It means I want to be baptized. And I want to tell people what Eva's love showed me about God's love. There are other wounded people out there, other people who think they're too broken for grace. Pastor Thornfield smiled through his tears. I think Eva would be very proud. I think she knew this day would come long before I did. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the bed Eva and I had shared for 43 years, holding the wooden cross she'd carved during our first fight. And something inside me began to crumble, not in a good way, in a terrifying, overwhelming way that made me question everything I'd felt over the past week. By 3 a.m., I was pacing the kitchen like a caged animal, my mind racing with doubts that crashed over me like a tsunami. What if I was just a grief-stricken old man desperate to feel connected to his dead wife? What if Eva's prophecies were just coincidences I was reading too much into? What if this whole spiritual awakening was nothing more than the delusions of a lonely widower who'd lost his anchor to reality? I stared at myself in the bathroom mirror and saw what I'd always seen, a stubborn, broken man who'd spent 82 years running from God. Who was I kidding? People don't change at my age. Leopards don't change their spots, and cynics don't become believers just because their wives leave them touching letters and carved crosses. The rational part of my mind, the part that had served me well for 8 decades, began dismantling every spiritual experience I'd had over the past week. The feeling of presence in the church pew, probably just emotional manipulation combined with good acoustics. Pastor Thornfield's sermon seeming personally directed. Pure coincidence. Preachers talk about the prodigal son all the time. Eva's accurate predictions. Lucky guesses from a woman who'd known me for 60 years. By sunrise, I was in full retreat. I called Pastor Thornfield and left a rambling voicemail. Pastor, it's Hart. I think I made a mistake yesterday. Got caught up in the emotion of it all. I'm not ready for baptism or testimony or any of it. I'm sorry for wasting your time. I spent the next 3 days avoiding everyone. The phone, the door, even the mailbox. I couldn't face the possibility that people might ask me about my conversion experience because I was no longer sure it had been real. Wednesday evening, as I sat in my recliner nursing my third bourbon of the day, someone knocked on my front door. I ignored it. They knocked again, more persistently. "Hart McKinnon, I know you're in there," came a woman's voice. "This is Margaret Caldwell from down the street. Eva asked me to check on you if you ever started hiding from the world." Margaret Caldwell. I vaguely remembered her. A widow in her 70s who lived 3 houses down, someone Ava had been friends with, but I'd barely noticed in all our years as neighbors. I shuffled to the door and opened it to find a small, fierce-looking woman with silver hair and eyes that reminded me uncomfortably of Eva's, kind but unflinching. "You look terrible," she said without preamble, pushing past me into my living room. "When's the last time you showered or ate something that wasn't liquid?" "Mrs. Caldwell, I appreciate your concern, but I'm fine." "No, you're not. You're having what my late husband used to call the dark night of the soul. It's what happens when someone gets close to God and then panics because they think they don't deserve it." She settled into Eva's chair without invitation, and something about her complete lack of intimidation made me sit down across from her. "Eva told me about you," she continued. "About your struggles with faith, about what happened to you as a child. She also told me that if you ever got close to surrendering to God, you'd probably try to run away at the last minute." "I'm not running away. I'm being realistic. I'm an 82-year-old atheist who got emotional at his wife's funeral. That doesn't make me a convert." Margaret studied me for a long moment. "Hart, can I tell you something about Eva that you might not know?" I nodded reluctantly. 15 years ago, when I was diagnosed with cancer, I lost my faith completely, raged at God, stopped going to church, told everyone that prayer was useless superstition. I was bitter and angry and convinced that if God existed, he was cruel. She paused, smoothing her skirt with hands that showed the spots and wrinkles of her age. Eva came to see me every day during chemotherapy, not to preach or quote scripture or tell me everything happens for a reason. She just sat with me while I was sick and angry and faithless. For 8 months, she loved me through the darkest period of my life without asking for anything in return. That sounds like Eva. The day I finished my last treatment, I asked her why she'd wasted so much time on someone who'd turned her back on God. You know what she said? I shook my head. She said, "Margaret, God doesn't stop loving us when we stop believing in him, and neither do I. Faith isn't about never having doubts. It's about choosing love in spite of them." Margaret leaned forward, her eyes intense. "Hart, you're not having a crisis of faith. You're having faith for the first time in your life, and it's terrifying because it means admitting that maybe, just maybe, you're not in control of everything." I felt tears starting to form and tried to blink them away. But what if I'm wrong? What if I'm just an old fool chasing his dead wife's fantasies? Then you'll be an old fool who learned to love and forgive and hope. And frankly, Hart McKinnon, there are worse things to be. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street where she and Eva had been neighbors for decades. "Eva left me something for you," she said quietly. "She gave it to me 6 months before she died, said I'd know when you needed it." From her purse, she pulled out a small envelope with my name on it in Eva's handwriting. Another letter. A different kind of letter. She called it "For Hart's Dark Night." My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with just a few lines. "My dearest Hart, if you're reading this, then you're scared. You're doubting everything and wondering if you've lost your mind. That's okay. Even Jesus asked God if there was another way. Doubt isn't the opposite of faith. Indifference is. You're fighting so hard against believing because deep down you know it's true. Stop fighting, my love. Just for once in your stubborn life, stop fighting and let yourself be loved. The God I know has been waiting 82 years for this moment. He's not going anywhere." Eva, I sat there holding that letter, and slowly, the panic that had consumed me for 3 days began to dissolve. Margaret Caldwell sat quietly beside me, providing the same kind of wordless presence that Eva had given her during chemotherapy. "I'm scared," I finally whispered. "Of course you are. You're about to let go of the thing that's defined you for 8 decades. But heart, what if instead of losing yourself, you're about to find who you were always meant to be? Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across my living room. For the first time in days, the darkness didn't feel overwhelming. It felt like preparation for dawn. That night, Margaret Caldwell's words echoing in my mind, I fell into the deepest sleep I'd had in months. And for the first time since I was 7 years old, I had a dream that didn't end in terror. I found myself standing in a vast field of wheat, golden and swaying in a warm breeze that carried the scent of home-baked bread and fresh rain. The sky above was the kind of blue you only see in childhood memories, endless and perfect. I was young again, not 7, not the broken boy from the orphanage, but maybe 12 or 13, old enough to understand, but young enough to still believe in wonder. Heart! The voice came from behind me, gentle but unmistakable. I turned and saw a man walking toward me through the wheat. He was ordinary looking, average height, brown hair, working man's hands, but his eyes held every sunset I'd ever seen, every laugh Ava had ever shared with me, every moment of beauty I'd witnessed in 8 decades of living. Are you? I couldn't finish the question. He smiled, and it was like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. I'm who I've always been, Heart. The one your wife talked to every morning, the one she saw in every sunset, the one who's been walking beside you even when you couldn't see me. I don't understand. I've been running from you my whole life. I know. He gestured to the field around us. This is what you've been running toward, not away from. Peace, home, the place where wounds become wisdom and pain becomes purpose. As we walked together through the wheat, the landscape began to change, showing me scenes from my life like a movie playing across the horizon. But these weren't the memories I usually carried, the dark ones, the painful ones. These were moments I'd forgotten or dismissed. Look, he said, pointing to a shimmering image in the distance. Christmas morning, 1967. I watched my younger self sitting on our living room floor, assembling a dollhouse for a neighbor's daughter whose father had been killed in Vietnam. Ava sat beside me, holding pieces and humming Christmas carols while I cursed at the tiny hinges that wouldn't fit right. I remember that, I whispered. Little Amy Patterson. Her mother couldn't afford much that year. You worked on that dollhouse for 3 weeks in secret, he said. Every night after Eva went to sleep. You told yourself you were just being neighborly, but you were actually being my hands and feet in the world. Another scene appeared. Me at 45, teaching my nephew how to change oil in a car. The boy was struggling, frustrated to the point of tears, and I saw myself kneel down to his level and say, "Son, the best things in life are worth struggling for. Don't quit on yourself." I'd forgotten about that too. I haven't forgotten any of it, Heart. Every act of love, every moment of compassion, every time you chose kindness over bitterness despite your own pain. I was there. You've been serving me without knowing it for 75 years. We stopped walking, and he turned to face me fully. Do you know why Eva could see this day coming? I shook my head. Because she saw you the way I see you, not as the broken child who was hurt by someone who claimed to represent me, not as the angry young man who built walls to protect himself. She saw the man I created you to be, someone who understands suffering so deeply that he can bring healing to others who suffer. But I've been so angry, so bitter. Anger at injustice is not sin, Heart, it's righteousness. The question is what you do with it. You can let it poison you, or you can let it fuel your compassion for other wounded people. Around us, the wheat field began to shimmer and transform into something else, a gathering place where people of all ages stood in small groups, talking quietly. I recognized some of them, the broken, the lost, the ones who'd given up on God because someone who claimed to serve him had hurt them. This is why you're here, he said simply. Not just for your own healing, but to be a bridge for others who think they're too damaged for grace. Who better to reach them than someone who's walked the same dark path? I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to be what you're asking me to be. He smiled again, and I felt that warmth spread through me like sunlight after a long winter. Hart, you already know how. You've been practicing your whole life without realizing it. Every time Ava was sick and you sat by her bed. Every time you helped a neighbor fix their car without being asked. Every time you chose love over bitterness despite your pain. But I need to forgive him first, don't I, Father Mackenzie? Yes, not because he deserves it, but because you do. Forgiveness isn't about him anymore, Hart. It's about you choosing freedom over the prison you've been living in. I looked around at the people gathered in this place of healing, and for the first time in my life, I could see myself among them. Not as the wounded child or the angry atheist, but as someone who understood both suffering and redemption. Will you help me? I asked. I don't think I can do this alone. Hart, he said, his voice full of infinite tenderness. I've been helping you your whole life. You just couldn't see it because you were looking for lightning bolts when I was working through hospital visits and casseroles, through Ava's patient love and quiet prayers, through every moment of beauty that reminded you that the world contains more than just pain. He reached out and placed his hand on my shoulder, and I felt 75 years of fear and anger begin to melt away like ice in spring. Your wife is here too, you know. She wanted to see this moment. I turned and saw Eva walking toward us through the wheat, young and radiant, but with the wisdom of all our years together shining in her eyes. When she reached me, she didn't speak. She just smiled the smile that had captivated me for 60 years and placed her hand over my heart. I knew you'd find your way home eventually, she said softly. You always were too stubborn to stay lost forever. I woke in my own bed as dawn light streamed through the windows, tears streaming down my face. But for the first time in decades, they weren't tears of pain or regret. They were tears of recognition, of coming home to myself after a lifetime of exile. I knew what I had to do. I drove to the ruins of St. Mary's Orphanage on a grey Saturday morning, 3 weeks after Eva's death, and 2 days after the dream that had changed everything. The building had been abandoned for 30 years, its windows boarded up, weeds growing through cracks in the foundation. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, but time and weather had created gaps large enough for an old man to squeeze through. Pastor Thornfield had offered to come with me, but this was something I needed to do alone. Some ghosts can only be faced in solitude. The building looked smaller than I remembered, the way childhood places always do when you return as an adult. But standing there in the shadow of those crumbling brick walls, I was 7 years old again, small and terrified, and utterly alone in the world. I walked around the perimeter slowly, my cane tapping against broken concrete, memories flooding back with each step. There was the window to the dormitory where I'd spent 3 sleepless years. There was the chapel where Father Mackenzie had delivered sermons about God's love while planning his next victim. There was the basement entrance where he'd taken us, one by one, to steal our innocence and our faith. For 75 years, I'd carried this place inside me like a cancer. Every sleepless night, every moment of rage against God, every time I'd flinched away from Ava's gentle attempts to share her faith, it all traced back to these walls and what had happened inside them. But standing there now, something had changed. The building was just brick and mortar, slowly returning to dust. The power it had held over me existed only in my memory, and memories could be rewritten by choices made in the present. I found a broken section of wall and sat down heavily, pulling out the letter Eva had written to Father Mackenzie, but never sent. Reading her words again in this place felt like bringing light into a darkness that had seemed absolute. You were wrong about me, I said aloud to the empty air, addressing the man who'd been dead for 15 years. You told me I was worthless, that God could never love someone like me. You said I deserved what you did to me because I was bad, because I asked too many questions, because I cried too much. My voice echoed off the abandoned buildings, but I continued. You were wrong about God too. The God you claimed to serve while you hurt children, that wasn't God at all. That was your own darkness wearing a collar and pretending to be holy. I stood up and walked to where the chapel had been. The roof had collapsed years ago, leaving only 4 walls open to the sky. Inside, pigeons nested where the altar had once stood, and wildflowers grew through cracks in the floor. "I forgive you, Patrick Mackenzie." The words came out rusty, like a door opening for the first time in decades. Not because you ever asked for forgiveness, not because you deserved it. I forgive you because I'm tired of carrying you around with me. I'm 82 years old, and I want to be free. I expected to feel something dramatic, a rush of relief, a weight lifting from my shoulders, maybe even some kind of divine confirmation. Instead, forgiveness felt like exhaling a breath I'd been holding for 3/4 of a century. Simple, quiet, complete. But then something else happened. As I stood in that ruined chapel, I began to remember other things. Not just the abuse, but the moments of kindness from other staff members. Sister Catherine, who'd slipped me extra food when I was being punished. Mr. Williams, the maintenance man who'd taught me to fix things with my hands and told me I was smart enough to build whatever I could imagine. I remembered the other boys too, not just as fellow victims, but as friends who'd shared whatever small treasures they had. Tommy Brennan, who'd given me his only marble when I was crying after a particularly bad night. David Kowalski, who'd taught me to tie proper knots and told me stories about the circus to help me fall asleep. For the first time in my life, I allowed myself to see that even in the darkest place, there had been light. Even in the presence of evil, there had been love. God hadn't been absent from St. Mary's. He'd been present in every act of kindness, every moment of comfort shared between broken children, every adult who'd tried to show us we were worth protecting. "You couldn't destroy that," I said to the ruins, meaning both Mackenzie and the institution that had failed to protect us. "You hurt us, but you couldn't destroy the image of God in us. We survived. We grew up. Some of us even learned to love." I pulled out my phone and called Pastor Thornfield. When he answered, I could hear concern in his voice. "Hart, are you all right? You sound different." "I'm at St. Mary's," I said, "the old orphanage, and Pastor, I'm ready." "Ready for what?" "To be baptized, to tell my story, to help other people who think they're too broken for God's love." I looked around at the ruins one last time. I spent 75 years thinking this place defined me, but it didn't. It's just where my story began, not where it ends. "Hart, are you sure? This is a big decision." I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in decades. "Pastor, I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Ava was right. God's been chasing me my whole life. I'm tired of running." "When do you want to do this?" "Next Sunday, during regular service. I want people to see that it's never too late to come home." As I walked back to my truck, I turned for one last look at St. Mary's. The building was still there, still abandoned and crumbling, but it no longer held any power over me. It was just a place where a broken little boy had learned to survive, and where an old man had finally learned to forgive. The drive home took me past Cornerstone Baptist, where Eva had worshipped faithfully for 60 years while praying for my stubborn soul. For the first time in my life, I looked forward to Sunday morning. I had a story to tell, and people who needed to hear it, people who thought their wounds disqualified them from grace, people who believed their past defined their future, people who'd given up on the possibility of redemption. Thanks to Eva's patient love and God's persistent pursuit, I finally understood what I was meant to do with the rest of whatever time I had left. 2 days before my planned baptism, I was sitting in my kitchen reading one of Eva's prayer journals when the phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something compelled me to answer. "Mr. McKinnon, this is Dr. Sarah Chen from the University of Alabama's Department of Social Work. I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Dr. Chen. How can I help you?" "Sir, I'm calling because we're conducting a research study on long-term impacts of institutional abuse, and your wife contacted us several months before her death. She said you might be willing to participate once you were ready." My blood went cold. "Eva contacted you about me?" "Yes, sir. She was very specific." She said you'd been a victim of clergy abuse as a child at St. Mary's Orphanage, and that someday you might want to help other survivors by sharing your story in an academic context. She left very detailed instructions about when and how to contact you. I set down my coffee cup with shaking hands. What kind of instructions? Well, this is where it gets remarkable, Mr. McKinnon. She told us to call you exactly 3 months after her death on a Tuesday morning and said you'd have just visited the ruins of St. Mary's and would be preparing for baptism the following Sunday. The room seemed to tilt sideways. She knew when I'd be baptized? Nay, she was very specific about the timing. She also said to tell you that there were 17 other boys at St. Mary's during your time there who survived Father Mackenzie's abuse. 12 are still alive, and 8 of them have been searching for other survivors for years, but didn't know how to find you. I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles went white. Other survivors looking for me? Mr. McKinnon, your wife somehow knew that your story wouldn't just help your local congregation. She knew it would connect you with the other boys from St. Mary's, men in their 70s and 80s now, who've carried the same wounds you have. She left us contact information for a support network she'd been quietly building for months before her death. A support network? She called it the St. Mary's Brotherhood, survivors of Father Mackenzie, and the institutional failures that enabled him. She'd tracked down 7 of the 8 men through public records and social media. They've been meeting monthly via video calls for the past year, sharing their stories and supporting each other's healing. They just didn't know how to reach you because you've always kept such a private life. I felt dizzy. Eva did all this without telling me. She said she was preparing the way for you to find your purpose after her death. Mr. McKinnon, these men have been praying for you specifically. She told them your name and your story. With your permission, she said, though I'm not sure how she could have had that. She had it. I whispered, remembering the dream where Jesus had told me my purpose was to help other wounded people. Dr. Chen, who are these men? Do I know any of them? Well, there's Thomas Brennan in Mobile. He said you might remember him as Tommy. He's the one who gave you a marble when you were crying. My heart nearly stopped. Tommy Brennan? He's alive, very much so. He's been a counselor specializing in childhood trauma for 40 years. Then there's David Kowalski in Huntsville, a retired engineer who teaches knot tying to Boy Scouts. He said you might remember circus stories. Tears streamed down my face. They remember me. Mr. McKinnon, they never forgot you. None of them forgot any of the others. They've been carrying each other's names in their hearts for 75 years, hoping someday to reconnect. Dr. Chen's voice grew gentle. Your wife left one more message for you. She said to tell you that God doesn't waste pain. He transforms it into purpose. She said your story of finding faith at 82 would give hope to these men who thought it was too late for them to heal too. Too late for them to heal. Sir, 3 of these 8 men have attempted suicide in the past decade. 2 are completely estranged from their families because of trust issues stemming from the abuse. 1 has been in and out of psychiatric hospitals for years. They've all given up on the possibility of real peace. Until now. Until your wife told them about a stubborn man named Hart McKinnon, who was going to show them that it's never too late to come home. She said your baptism would be the beginning of something bigger than just personal healing. I sat in stunned silence, understanding finally dawning on me. Eva hadn't just been praying for my individual salvation for 60 years. She'd been preparing me to be part of a larger healing that would touch the lives of 7 other broken men who'd shared my nightmare. Dr. Chen, how do I contact them? They're actually planning to attend your baptism, if you're comfortable with that. They want to drive to Alabama to witness what they're calling the miracle Eva promised them. She told them about my baptism too. She told them everything, Mr. McKinnon. The date, the church, even that you'd be wearing a specific tie, a blue one with small yellow flowers that was a Father's Day gift from a daughter who died young. My breath caught. Sarah had given me that tie for Father's Day 1992, 3 years before the cancer took her. I'd planned to wear it Sunday as a way of having both Eva and Sarah with me symbolically. How could she possibly know that? I don't pretend to understand it, sir. But I can tell you that these 7 men have been planning this trip for 3 months, convinced that witnessing your baptism will somehow heal wounds they thought were permanent. They've called it their pilgrimage of hope. I looked around my empty kitchen, seeing it now not as the lonely space of a widower, but as the preparation room for a ministry I'd never imagined. Ava hadn't just prayed for my salvation, she'd orchestrated my calling. Dr. Chen, please give them my phone number. Tell them Hart McKinnon is ready to come home, and he wants his brothers there to witness it. After I hung up, I sat in the silence for a long time, understanding finally why Eva had been so confident about my future. She hadn't just seen my individual conversion, she'd seen the beginning of a movement that would bring healing to 8 broken boys who'd grown into wounded men, all of them carrying the same scars, all of them thinking they were beyond redemption. Sunday couldn't come soon enough. Friday morning, 2 days before my baptism, I woke to find 7 voicemails on my phone. The first was from Tommy Brennan, and hearing his voice after 75 years made me weep before he'd spoken 10 words. Hart McKinnon, brother, this is Tommy Brennan from St. Mary's. I can't believe we're actually going to see each other again. I've thought about you almost every day for 75 years, wondering if you made it out okay, if you found peace. Your Eva found me 6 months before she died. Told me you were going to find your way to God and that it would help the rest of us find our way too. Art, I've been clean and sober for 20 years, been helping other abuse survivors for 40, but I never found real peace until Eva told me you were coming home. See you Sunday, brother. I'll be the old man crying in the front row. Each voicemail was similar. Grown men in their 70s and 80s, sobbing as they spoke, thanking me for giving them hope they'd thought was impossible. David Kowalski, the circus storyteller, now a grandfather of 12, who'd spent his life building things, because if you can build something good, it proves you're not broken inside. Robert Sullivan, who'd become a police detective specializing in crimes against children. James Murphy, a teacher who'd dedicated his life to protecting vulnerable kids. Each of them had found ways to transform their pain into purpose, but none had found the peace that comes with genuine faith. Until Eva had reached out to them with a promise that seemed impossible, one of their own was going to show them the way home. Saturday afternoon, Pastor Thornfield came to my house for what he called baptism preparation, but what felt more like a counseling session for a man about to face the most vulnerable moment of his life. Tomorrow morning, you're going to stand in front of 300 people and tell them why you're choosing baptism at 82. Are you ready for that? I looked at the notes I'd been scribbling all week. Fragments of my story, pieces of Eva's journey, memories of St. Mary's that I'd never spoken aloud. Pastor, I've never been ready for anything in my life, but Eva taught me that being ready isn't the point. Being willing is. What do you want people to understand about your story? I thought about the 7 men driving from across Alabama to witness my baptism, men who'd carried the same wounds I'd carried, who'd survived the same darkness, but hadn't found the same light. I want them to understand that God doesn't waste anything, not even the worst things that happen to us. I spent 75 years thinking that what happened at St. Mary's disqualified me from God's love, but now I see that it actually qualified me for something else. Understanding how much other wounded people need to hear that they're not too broken for grace. Pastor Thornfield nodded. And you're comfortable with the baptism itself? The physical act of going under the water? I smiled, remembering something Ava had written in one of her letters to God. Lord, when Hart finally goes under that water, he's not just being baptized, he's being born. Born at 82 into the life you always intended for him. Pastor, I've been drowning in my own pain for 8 decades. Going underwater to come up clean sounds like the best deal I've ever been offered. One more thing, Hart. Your St. Mary's brothers will be there tomorrow, but so will Mrs. Caldwell, the Hendersons, the Patterson family, and dozens of other people who've watched Ava pray for you for 60 years. Some of them might be emotional. You mean they might cry? I mean they might shout. Mrs. Patterson told me yesterday that she's been praying for your salvation since 1965. She said watching you get baptized will be like watching the Red Sea part. That evening, I did something I'd never done before. I prayed. Not the angry bargaining I'd done in hospital waiting rooms, not the desperate pleading during Eva's final illness, but actual conversation with the God I was finally ready to acknowledge. Lord, I said, sitting in the chair where Eva used to read her Bible every morning, tomorrow I'm going to tell people about you in front of the church where my wife worshipped you faithfully for 60 years while I sat at home being stubborn. I'm not sure I know how to do this right. I paused, expecting to feel foolish, but instead feeling like I was talking to someone who'd been waiting patiently for this conversation my entire life. Eva used to say, "You had a plan for me." If that's true, if tomorrow is part of that plan, then help me find the words. Help me show those 7 men from St. Mary's that it's never too late to come home. Help me honor Ava's faith and your patience. I looked around the room where Ava and I had shared our last conversation, where she'd told me with complete confidence that I'd find my way to God. Tomorrow, in front of everyone who'd ever known us as a couple, I was going to prove that her faith hadn't been misplaced. And Lord, I added, almost whispering, thank you for loving me enough to send me a woman who never gave up on your plan for my life. I understand now why you had to take her first. She had to go ahead and prepare the way, just like she always did. I went to bed that night, wearing the blue tie with small yellow flowers that Sarah had given me for Father's Day 1992. Eva had somehow known I'd wear it, just like she'd known everything else about this day that hadn't happened yet. Tomorrow, Hart McKinnon was going to die and be reborn in front of everyone who'd ever known him as the stubborn atheist who'd married the preacher's daughter. And 7 broken boys who'd grown into wounded men were going to witness a miracle they'd been praying for without knowing it for 75 years. I couldn't wait. Sunday morning arrived, with the kind of clear, crisp Alabama sunshine that Eva always said was God's way of smiling on special occasions. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, adjusting Sarah's blue tie with the small yellow flowers, and for the first time in 8 decades, I didn't recognize the man looking back at me. Oh, I looked the same, 82 years old, weathered face, hands spotted with age, but my eyes were different. The anger was gone. The fear was gone. What remained was something I'd never seen in my own reflection before: peace. The drive to Cornerstone Baptist took forever, and no time at all. My truck seemed to float down streets I'd traveled thousands of times, but today everything looked different, brighter, more alive, as if I was seeing the world through new eyes. The parking lot was fuller than I'd ever seen it. Cars with license plates from Mobile, Huntsville, Birmingham, and places I didn't recognize filled every space. Word had gotten out somehow that Hart McKinnon was finally coming home. As I walked toward the church doors, a group of 7 men stood waiting for me. Even after 75 years, I recognized them immediately. Older, grayer, bearing the marks of long lives lived, but still the boys I'd known at St. Mary's. Tommy Brennan, now a slight man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. David Kowalski, tall and lean with calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime building things. The others I recognized by their smiles, their posture, the way they held themselves like men who'd learned to be strong in broken places. Hart. Tommy was the first to speak, his voice thick with emotion. Brother, look at you. Look at us. We made it. We all made it, I said. And suddenly we were embracing. 8 old men crying in a church parking lot, holding each other the way we should have been allowed to hold each other when we were 7 years old, and the world was trying to break us. Ava promised us this day would come, David said through his tears. She said you'd show us the way home. We're all going home today, I replied, all of us together. Inside the sanctuary, the pews were packed beyond capacity. People stood along the walls, sat in folding chairs in the aisles, and I even saw faces pressed against the windows from outside. Mrs. Caldwell sat in the front row, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. The Patterson family had claimed an entire pew, all of them beaming like they were watching their own grandfather get married. Pastor Thornfield began the service with a smile so wide it seemed to light up the entire building. Friends, we are gathered today to witness something extraordinary, something that reminds us that God's timing is perfect, His love is patient, and His grace knows no expiration date. The hymns seemed to soar that morning. Amazing grace, come thou fount, and finally, just as I am. As the congregation sang that last hymn, Pastor Thornfield looked directly at me and nodded. This was it. I stood on legs that felt both weak and strong, walked to the front of the church where I'd never stood before, and turned to face 300 people who'd watched Eva pray for this moment for 60 years. "My name is Hart McKinnon," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary. "And at 82 years old, I'm here to tell you that it's never too late to come home." I told them about St. Mary's, about Father Mackenzie, about 75 years of running from a God I thought was cruel. I told them about Ava's patient love, about her final words, about the prophecy that had brought me to this moment. I told them about finding the 7 men who'd shared my nightmare, about Eva's secret preparation for a healing none of us had thought possible. For 75 years, I thought my story was about what was taken from me, I said, looking directly at my St. Mary's brothers in the front row. But today, I understand that my story is about what God can do with what's broken. He doesn't waste our pain. He transforms it into purpose. The sanctuary was silent except for the sound of crying. Not sad tears, but the tears that come when something impossible becomes real. Pastor Thornfield stepped forward. "Hart McKinnon, do you accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior?" "I do." "Do you believe that He died for your sins and rose again to give you eternal life?" "I do." "Then it's my joy to baptize you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit." As we walked to the baptismal pool at the front of the church, I heard something that made my heart nearly burst. The sound of 7 grown men weeping with joy. My saint, Mary's brothers, weren't just watching my baptism. They were experiencing their own spiritual breakthrough through witnessing mine. The water was warm as Pastor Thornfield lowered me backward. For just a moment, I was completely submerged, completely surrendered, completely washed clean of 8 decades of pain and anger and fear. When I came up out of that water, gasping and laughing and crying all at once, the entire congregation erupted. People were standing, shouting, applauding, crying. Mrs. Caldwell was sobbing into her handkerchief. The Patterson family was hugging each other like they'd just witnessed the resurrection itself. But the sound that meant the most to me came from the front row, where 7 old men were on their feet, cheering for the brother who'd finally found his way home and shown them the way too. As I stood there dripping wet in front of that joyful congregation, I felt something I'd never experienced before, the absolute certainty that I was exactly where God had always intended me to be. Not despite my past, but because of it. Not in spite of my wounds, but through them. Eva had been right. God had been chasing me my whole life, and He'd finally caught me. But this wasn't the end of the story. As I looked at those 7 faces in the front row, I realized it was just the beginning. 3 weeks after my baptism, I was sitting in my kitchen reading one of Eva's prayer journals when the phone rang. It was Dr. Sarah Chen from the University of Alabama, and her voice was filled with excitement I'd never heard before. "Mr. McKinnon, I have news that's going to astound you. Do you remember our conversation about the 8 survivors from St. Mary's? Of course, 7 of them were at my baptism. It was the most beautiful day of my life. Well, something unprecedented has happened. Since your baptism 3 weeks ago, all 7 of those men have reached out to me requesting information about faith-based counseling and local churches in their areas. But that's not the remarkable part." I set down my coffee cup. "What's the remarkable part? Word about your story has spread through survivor networks across the Southeast. Mr. McKinnon, in the past 3 weeks, I've received calls from 43 other survivors of institutional abuse. People in their 70s and 80s who heard about an 82-year-old man finding faith after a lifetime of rejection, and it's given them hope they thought was impossible. My hands started shaking. 43 people. Catholic orphanages, Baptist children's homes, Methodist youth facilities, decades of survivors who thought they were too old, too damaged, too angry to ever find peace. Your story has created what we're calling the Hart-McKinnon effect. Elderly survivors realizing that healing can happen at any age. Dr. Chen, I don't understand. I just got baptized. I didn't do anything special. Mr. McKinnon, you proved something that trauma counselors have been trying to convince clients of for decades, that it's never too late for redemption. But more than that, you showed them that God doesn't require you to pretend your trauma didn't happen. You brought your scars with you into faith, and that's given permission to others to do the same. That afternoon, Pastor Thornfield called with even more surprising news. Hart, I've had the most extraordinary week. Do you know about the calls I've been receiving? Dr. Chen mentioned that other survivors have been reaching out. It's not just survivors, Hart. It's their families, children and grandchildren who've watched their parents carry trauma for decades. A woman from Georgia drove here yesterday with her 78-year-old father who was abused at a church camp in the 1940s. She said she'd been praying for his healing for 30 years, and when she heard about your baptism, she knew God was giving her father one last chance. What happened? He asked me to baptize him next Sunday, and Hart, he's not the only one. I have 6 other elderly people scheduled for baptism over the next month, all of them trauma survivors who thought they'd missed their opportunity for faith. Pastor, this is getting bigger than I ever imagined. It gets bigger still. The Southern Baptist Convention wants to interview you for their newsletter. They're calling your story The Great Late in Life Awakening and want to use it to reach other elderly people who think they're beyond God's grace. That evening, Tommy Brennan called from Mobile with news that left me speechless. Hart, brother, I need to tell you what's happened since your baptism. Remember how I told you I'd been helping trauma survivors for 40 years, but never found real peace myself? I remember. Well, watching you go under that water did something to me. I can't explain it, but 75 years of carrying that darkness just lifted. I drove home from your baptism, and for the first time in my adult life, I slept through the night without nightmares. Tommy, that's wonderful. But here's the thing. I've been calling the men and women I've counseled over the years, people who stopped coming because they thought healing was impossible at their age. 12 of them have asked me to help them find churches. 12 people who'd given up on God are ready to try again because they heard about us. About us. The St. Mary's Brotherhood. That's what they're calling us now. 8 men who proved that institutional trauma doesn't have the final word on our stories. We're becoming symbols of hope for people who thought hope was gone forever. Over the next few days, the calls kept coming. David Kowalski from Huntsville told me that his own grandchildren had started asking about faith for the first time, inspired by their grandfather's transformation. Robert Sullivan, the retired detective, said he'd been contacted by 3 other law enforcement officers who were childhood abuse survivors seeking guidance about finding peace in their later years. But the call that broke me completely came from James Murphy, the retired teacher. Hart, I need to tell you about something that happened yesterday. I was at the grocery store wearing the St. Mary's Brotherhood t-shirt that David made for us, and this woman approached me. She was probably in her 50s, and she said, "Excuse me, are you one of those men from the Hart-McKinnon story?" What did you tell her? I told her yes, and she started crying right there in the cereal aisle. Turns out, her father was abused at a religious facility in the 1950s and had been an angry atheist his whole life. She said he'd watched the video of your baptism online and asked her to help him find a church. There's a video online? Hart, someone filmed your baptism and testimony on their phone and posted it. It's been viewed over 50,000 times. The comments section is full of elderly people saying they thought it was too late for them until they saw you. I sat in my kitchen that night, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. Eva's final prophecy was coming true in ways none of us had imagined. She hadn't just predicted my conversion. She'd predicted the beginning of a movement that would touch dozens of lives across the Southeast. But I had the feeling this was still just the beginning. Eva had seen something even bigger coming, something that would be revealed in the days ahead. I pulled out my phone and found the video of my baptism that James had mentioned. In the comment section, one message caught my attention. My grandfather is 85 and has been bitter about God his whole life because of what happened to him as a child. He watched this video and asked me to drive him to church next Sunday. Thank you, Mr. McKinnon, for showing him it's never too late to come home. I thought about Eva's final words. When I'm gone, you're going to find him. She'd been right, but she'd seen even further than that. She'd seen that my finding God would help dozens of other wounded souls find their way home too. The best was yet to come. 6 months after my baptism, I received a phone call that would reveal the true magnitude of Eva's final prophecy. It was a crisp October morning, and I was sitting in my kitchen reading my daily devotions, something that still amazed me at 83 years old when the phone rang. Mr. McKinnon, Mr. This is Detective Maria Santos from the Birmingham Police Department. I have some unusual news that I think you need to hear. My heart skipped. Is everything all right, Detective? Sir, it's about a man named Eugene Whitfield. He's 79 years old, and yesterday he walked into our station asking to speak with someone about Hart McKinnon and the St. Mary's Brotherhood. I don't know anyone by that name. That's just it, Mr. McKinnon. He knows you. Eugene Whitfield has been planning to take his own life for the past 2 years. Yesterday morning, he was sitting in his car with a gun, ready to end it all, when his neighbor's radio was playing a news story about your testimony and the healing movement it started among elderly trauma survivors. I gripped the phone tighter. Detective, please tell me he's safe. He's safe, sir, but here's where it gets remarkable. Mr. Whitfield heard your story about forgiveness and redemption at 82. And something inside him broke open. Instead of taking his life, he drove straight to our station and confessed to something he's been carrying for 60 years. Confessed to what? Mr. McKinnon, Eugene Whitfield was an orderly at St. Mary's Orphanage from 1950 to 1952. He was 17 years old when he started working there, and he witnessed Father Mackenzie abusing children. He knew what was happening, but he was young and scared and didn't know how to stop it. The world tilted. An orderly at St. Mary's, someone who'd witnessed our suffering. Detective, he was just a teenager himself. Why is he confessing now? Because he said your story of finding peace through forgiveness made him realize he could find peace through confession. But Mr. McKinnon, that's not why I'm calling. Eugene Whitfield has been keeping detailed records for 60 years. Names, dates, incidents. He documented everything Father Mackenzie did because he always hoped someday he'd find the courage to speak up. He has records, comprehensive records, including information about 17 boys who were victimized, 8 of whom are still alive. Mr. McKinnon, he can provide legal documentation that could finally bring official closure to what happened at St. Mary's. But he says he'll only share this information if you and the other survivors are willing to meet with him face to face. I sat in stunned silence. Eva's final prophecy hadn't just been about my conversion, or even about inspiring other survivors. She'd somehow seen that my story would give courage to a man who'd been carrying witnesses' testimony for 6 decades, a man whose guilt had driven him to the brink of suicide. Detective, where is Mr. Whitfield now? He's here at the station. Sir, he's been asking the same question over and over. Do you think those boys can ever forgive me? He says he's ready to meet his maker. But first, he needs to know if the children he failed to protect can find it in their hearts to forgive him. 2 hours later, I sat in a conference room at the Birmingham Police Department with the 6 St. Mary's brothers who could make the drive on short notice. Across from us sat a frail, elderly man with tears streaming down his weathered face, Eugene Whitfield, the teenager who'd been powerless to stop our abuse but had never stopped documenting it. "I was 17, he began, his voice barely audible. "Just a kid myself, working for 50 cents an hour to help my family. When I saw what Father Mackenzie was doing to you boys, I wanted to tell someone, but who would believe a teenager against a priest? So I started writing it all down, thinking someday I'd find the courage to speak up." He pulled out a worn composition notebook, its pages yellowed with age. "Every incident, every boy, every time that monster hurt one of you. I've carried this for 60 years, hating myself for not being brave enough to stop it." Tommy Brennan, now 83 and still the gentlest soul among us, reached across the table and placed his hand on Eugene's. "Son, you were 17 years old in 1950. Who would have listened to you? You did what you could. But I should have done more. I should have—" "Eugene," I interrupted, using the authoritative voice that had served me well for 8 decades. "Look at me." He raised his tear-filled eyes to mine. "You documented everything. You preserved evidence that could bring justice and closure to cases that were never properly investigated. You've carried this burden for 60 years, torturing yourself for being a scared teenager in an impossible situation. Do you know what I see when I look at you?" He shook his head. "I see another victim of Father Mackenzie. He didn't just abuse us boys. He traumatized every decent person who witnessed his evil and felt powerless to stop it. You've been suffering too, Eugene. It's time for your suffering to end." David Kowalski nodded. "Heart's right. You were a child too. If anyone should ask forgiveness, it's us for not understanding that you were carrying our pain all these years." What happened next was the most beautiful thing I'd witnessed since my own baptism. 7 old men who'd been brutalized as children surrounded one old man who'd been traumatized as a teenager, and we held each other while we cried 60 years of pain away. Eugene's documentation led to the official vindication we'd never received. The Catholic diocese formally apologized and established a victim compensation fund. More importantly, Eugene's courage inspired 12 other institutional employees from that era to come forward with their own suppressed testimonies. But the real miracle happened 3 weeks later. Eugene Whitfield, the man who'd planned to take his own life, was baptized at Cornerstone Baptist Church. Pastor Thornfield said it was the first time he'd ever baptized someone who'd been forgiven by the very people he thought he'd failed. As I watched Eugene go under that water and come up weeping with joy, I finally understood the full scope of Eva's final prophecy. She hadn't just seen my conversion coming. She'd seen that my story would create a ripple effect that would bring healing to survivors, hope to their families, courage to witnesses who'd carried guilt for decades, and ultimately, salvation to a man who'd been planning to end his life. 6 months earlier, I'd been a bitter 82-year-old atheist sitting by his dying wife's bedside. Now I was part of a movement that had touched over 200 lives across the Southeast. Survivors finding churches, families finding hope, witnesses finding forgiveness, and lost souls finding their way home. Eva had been right about everything. God had been chasing me my whole life, and when he finally caught me, he used my surrender to start a rescue mission for dozens of other wounded hearts. At 83 years old, I finally understood my purpose. I was living proof that it's never too late to come home, and that the God who heals broken hearts doesn't waste a single tear we've cried or a single year we've wandered. Eva's last whispered words had indeed changed everything, not just for me, but for everyone whose life had been touched by the love that wouldn't let go.